come on up, please.
It looks like I'm gonna be really guessing because I assumed there was a lectern up here. So I didn't even think about it.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, good. All right, well, we're ready to get going with the last really informative session here of the morning before lunch. So I know you'll be hungry, so you'll be paying close attention. That's great. We've got a good session again of the pilot projects, from issues affecting women in the workplace to just additional dimensions of things going on from as a result of the COVID pandemic. So we have 3 presenters in person, 1 virtually, and the first presenter this morning will be Aashna Waiwood from the University of South Florida, and she will be talking about workplace experiences and the postpartum return to work. So,
All right, good morning, thank you. So my name's Aashna, and I'll be talking about a data collection I did for my thesis that we call the Postpartum Work and Health Study, that looks at the intersection of work and maternity in the pregnancy and postpartum periods. And specifically, I'm going to be doing a broad overview of findings from different sort of sub-projects under this study. So a little bit of background on why I conducted this study. Specifically in the maternity phase, which spans from pregnancy through to post-childbirth, there's a lot of unique work-related challenges that come into play. For instance, there's different hormonal and physiological changes ongoing that are going to impact your time at work. You women, because of their maternity status, often experience stereotyping and discrimination. There is often a need for work accommodations, particularly in pregnancy. Women often have to negotiate leave policies when they're returning back to work. And then, of course, the return to work postpartum is its own whole sphere, making that transition back after you've been away for a while, which also might include managing breastfeeding at work, perhaps also experiencing postpartum anxiety or depression, and as well as the fact that there's a really high turnover rate in the postpartum period, where women might be leaving the workforce either temporarily or altogether. So clearly there's some factors going on that need to be explored there, but really what's frustrating is that these physiological experiences tied to maternity can often be considered, uncomfortable or taboo topics in management research, and so there's not a lot that we actually know about women's experiences. And so the primary goals of the study, including, first of all, just broadly shedding light on women's pregnancy and postpartum experiences at work, and also to look at factors that are associated with better or worse outcomes when you are either an impending or a new mother. So a broad overview of some of the findings I'll cover in today's talk. First, I'll spend a little bit of time on pregnancy, looking at women's work context, meaning if they were remote, in the office, or in some sort of hybrid situation, and how that influences various pregnancy experiences. Also, in the postpartum phase, I'll look at different factors that relate to women's perceived readjustment when they're returning back to work, as well as their engagement in some health behaviors. And then finally, I spend a little bit of time specifically on breastfeeding back at work, including things like how breastfeeding resources might relate to actual breastfeeding behavior. So a little bit about the data collection. We recruited women into the study who were in their 3rd trimester of pregnancy, currently employed, working at least 20 hours per week in a daytime schedule, and not self-employed. And finally, because we wanted to look at women who were having to return to work relatively quickly, as is common in the US, we looked at leaves where they're intending to return to work within 3 months or less. Women were recruited from tons of different sources. This was a year-long data collection, and so these sources included things like various social media groups related to pregnancy experiences. We partnered with La Leche League, which is a charity on breastfeeding, and worked with their national and local members, and also ended up working with a ton of different locations that were frequented by pregnant women, such as, for example, some pregnancy yoga classes we advertised at. Participants received 5 surveys. The first was in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, and then following the birth of their child, we would find out their return to work date, and then send another survey 2 weeks after that date, then 4 weeks, and then 6 weeks after the return. So kind of really honing in on that immediate going back to work experience. And finally, we had a survey 6 months after the women had returned to work that's a little bit more of a long-term follow-up. In terms of who participated, we had approximately 530 women at the first wave that we brought in to the study. And then from there, of course, we did lose some women to, attrition from not returning to work or no longer being eligible, having a longer leave, things like that. So that brought us down to 412 women at wave 2. And then from there, retention was relatively steady with 396, 384, and then finally 365 women that we were able to survey all the way at the last wave. So a pretty decent-sized sample for our analyses. A little bit of background on the sample. They were widely recruited, so well representative of women across the US. Mean age of about 32, primarily white sample. Almost all were married or living with their partner, and a little over half were having their first child. And the average leave length was about 91 days, so pretty much just in that 90-day phase. Some women's leave ended up being longer without us knowing due to them having their child a little prematurely. So the first piece that we'll talk about related to pregnancy, so a little bit of context for this study is that we know in the existing literature that women are often disclosing their pregnancies often because of the visibility of their symptoms. For example, experiencing some morning sickness at work. And research is also showing that women, even post-disclosure, experience discrimination that is often tied to the visibility of their bodies. So, people see the baby bump and then they treat those women differently. And so the question kind of became, well, if you're remote and you're maybe only seen from the face up, how might that change your experiences when you're not, being monitored and you can't see maybe a lot of the symptoms that are going on? And also remote work might also provide, flexibility to attend medical appointments and other things that might keep your pregnancy a little bit more under wraps. So we collected both qualitative and quantitative data from our participants, and we found that when it comes to disclosure earlier on in the pregnancy, remote work was related to greater perceptions that you had control over the disclosure process, being able to disclose at a later time point, and I actually have some data here on the differences in the number of days of disclosure if you were primarily remote versus primarily in the office. And also being able to disclose to fewer people. So not necessarily having to tell everybody at work, but maybe only those who really need to know. And then when it came to post-disclosure, where you might just, even after people know, how often are they being reminded of your pregnancy, we found that remote work was related to less visibility of women's symptoms and other pregnancy experiences, like how they manage their symptoms. They were able to lay down when they needed to, for instance. And then that also tied in with having your pregnancy less commented on and having it being less of a focus, which many women who were in the office described as very frustrating when everyone was constantly talking about their pregnancies when they wanted to focus on who they were as employees. So being remote had clearly a lot of advantages here in the pregnancy period, and has real potential to help out with matters of discrimination and giving women greater control over that whole experience. Moving into the postpartum period, another set of findings that we had was related to women's self-reported readjustment in those 4 postpartum phases where we collected data. And so you can see here in this graph, we kind of model how there's a logarithmic growth in women's reported readjustment so that there's a pretty quick readjustment over time and then it sort of steadies on. But positive is that it is increasing over time. And we looked at various different predictors of readjustment, including things like women's personal situations related to their ability to manage their home lives, as well as resources at work that might be beneficial. And we found that family supportive supervisor behaviors, so having that supervisor who cares about you as a mother as well, was positively related to initial readjustment, as was having reliable childcare, being able to share childcare more so with others at home, and interestingly, remote work was negatively related to initial readjustment. So counter to what I just mentioned with pregnancy, remote work here was less beneficial. And that might be because as you're going back, it might be helpful to be in person and really focused back on work versus being at home. We also looked at what influenced the growth And the only predictor that was significant there was childcare reliability, where it actually was related to less growth over time, but that was likely because it had such a strong effect on the initial intercept. There might have been like a regression to the mean effect where you couldn't increase much more when you're already at such a high point with good, reliable childcare. The next piece that I'll mention is actually my thesis study, where I looked at different family-friendly work resources and how they related to engagement in women's health behaviors, particularly sleep quality and quantity, as well as engagement in physical activity. And the reason that this is considered to be important is because becoming a parent in our research is known to be a period where you really lose engagement in a lot of these critical physical health behaviors that do have really long-term health impacts, especially sleep and physical activity. And that makes sense when you think about new moms. You know, you're losing a lot of sleep with a crying newborn and all of that, and don't have time to maybe get to the gym. And so we wanted to see what kind of resources workplaces could offer that would help being engaged in those health behaviors. And so I looked at a mediated model where different work-friendly resources might predict these health behaviors via reduction in work-family conflict. So essentially those resources were things like receiving family support from various sources at work, including more broadly the organization and their policies and the culture, as well as direct support from supervisors and coworkers on family-related matters. Also flexibility in the times you have to work and the place you might have to work, as well as different breastfeeding-specific resources, those that are instrumental or meant to be like tools to help you, as well as emotional and social forms of support from others at work. And specifically, we ended up finding that the model supported all of the resources except for Flex Place, which is similar to essentially remote work, for predicting sleep quality. So sleep quality is well predicted by having all of these work resources, with the exception of Flex Place. And then interestingly, for only Flex Place, there's a direct association with physical activity. So being able to be flexible in where you're working from seems to be related to being able to engage in more physical activity. And then finally, I'll briefly mention some findings related to breastfeeding and work. We already know that work makes it difficult to continue breastfeeding, and a lot of women report returning to work is why they stopped breastfeeding. And so, for example, when we first surveyed women in pregnancy, 96% said that they intended to continue, at least in part, breastfeeding upon returning to work. But when we actually look at what occurs, which is kind of shown better here in this graph, breastfeeding does decline a lot more upon that return. We have data on right before they returned, and then the 2 weeks after they had returned, what those breastfeeding rates look like. And so it does seem to be an important sort of cessation point, and those rates continue to decline over those weeks as women are back at work. One factor that we thought might influence breastfeeding would be remote work, so we keep coming back to remote work. And we thought that maybe women being at home might make it easier for them to breastfeed or pump because, you don't have to try to find a quiet space and all the tools to do so in the workplace with others. But interestingly, there was not an association here. So definitely worth further exploring. Another factor we looked at was childcare situations. Specifically, whoever was doing the childcare might change how easy it was to be able to breastfeed or pump. And so we looked at whether the childcare was occurring inside or outside the home, as well as whether it was occurring via a trusted source or maybe more an outside source like a daycare. And we found that whether the child was inside the home with you during the day or not at home with you actually didn't have an association with breastfeeding status. But there was a slight association, though not to a significant degree, of greater exclusive breastfeeding when women had a trusted source, such as their spouse, for example, or a family member doing the breastfeeding. So it might be easier perhaps to pass off breast milk when it's maybe a trusted source, for instance. And finally, I'll mention that we looked at a ton of different breastfeeding resources at work. We really broke it down into all different types of tools and equipment and space and time and support from others. And what we broadly find here is that breastfeeding resources are important to predicting actual breastfeeding behavior upon the initial return to work, especially instrumental resources like those tools, but that they become less important over time. So that correlation is what's being shown on the graph on the right, and that correlation goes down over time. As well as the fact that instrumental resources, especially instrumental resources, but emotional resources as well, are much more important when you're working a lot more time in the office, which would make sense because you're actively using those resources when you're not working remotely. And that is everything as far as the findings. So briefly, I just want to thank everybody who's made this research possible, which includes my advisor, Dr. Tammy Allen, as well as the many groups who funded this study, including the SciOps Small Grant, various psychology department awards, and the Sunshine ERC. Thank you.
Okay, and Aashna will be, excuse me, joining us back during the question and answer session. All right, our next presenter is Christine McGuire-Wolfe. Dr. McGuire-Wolfe is with the University of South Florida, and continuing in a vein of what we've been discussing so far, her title is Needs Assessment of Workplace Policy and Practice, Intentions, Barriers, and Supports for Women at All Stages of Childbearing in High-Demand Professions. Welcome.
This actually feeds very well off the last presentation. So as mentioned, the title of our project was a needs assessment of workplace policy and practice, intentions, barriers, and supports for women at all stages of childbearing in high-demand professions. That's a super long title, so we had shortened it to parenting and industry in high-demand professions. There we go. I wanted to mention our research team. It's actually a fairly large team of multidisciplinary fields. We have representatives from criminology, public health, anthropology, psychology. There you go. Psychology, and we also have a fairly strong student support group that's helping along with the project. So for our purposes, we identified several career fields that we were going to focus on. Those were emergency medicine, surgery, obstetrics, the fire service, emergency medical services, and law enforcement and public safety. These careers were identified because they shared some commonalities, which was that each of them had inherent safety risks, long hours or shift work, high-stakes decision-making, physical demands, and emotional impacts. They were also priority professions in terms of NIOSH categories. In these fields, women are generally underrepresented. There's also known gender disparities in both pay and career advancement. And so for those reasons, there were concerns about equity and fair treatment in the workplace, as well as application of total worker health principles. So for some background, so that we're all on the same page, some basic terminology for the study was work-family conflict. So in those instances, the work demands, work responsibilities impacted the ability to positively interact in their family role or their parental role. Family work conflict was the opposite, which was that family responsibilities, needs, demands pulled away from their ability to successfully meet their responsibilities in the workplace. And of course, work-life balance was the best case scenario when all of those were balanced together. So our objectives were to document the experiences of parents working in high-demand professions at all stages of parenting, which included planning for the decision whether to parent or not, whether they were expecting or pregnant themselves, and then actually parenting infants and young children. We also wanted to examine the organizational, cultural, and structural drivers of parental stressors in these work environments, and to explore intentions, barriers, and supports for each stage of parenting. These findings are intended to inform recommendations for organizational policy changes and advocacy for those changes. So it's important to note that the project addressed several of the NIOSH priority goals for extramural research. Those are listed out here, but primarily were related to total worker health in specific populations such as healthcare workers, law enforcement, fire service, EMS workers, and corrections officers. Our project aims were to examine work-life balance, to describe the impact of parenting and choosing career paths or leadership roles, to determine the impact of family needs on career decisions, and to explore structural and organizational policies that either supported or created issues for families. And then lastly was to identify similarities and differences between fathers and mothers in those high-demand professions. The methods were qualitative. For recruitment, we relied on emails and listservs and social media professional groups. It was convenience and snowball sampling. The interviews were mostly conducted by teams and audio recorded. They lasted about 60 minutes. We did not record by teams. We recorded by an external audio device, which seemed to be a very important factor for our law enforcement officers, that we weren't capturing images, that we were only capturing audio. We are still in the early stages of analysis, but are doing consistent comparison from our existing code book as well as emerging codes and themes. So there were several theoretical models that informed our semi-structured interview guide. Those are listed out here, but for the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and skip ahead. So for our participants, we originally had two groups that we intended to recruit for them. One was supervisors and the other were fathers. These were essentially self-identified groups. So what happened initially for supervisors, we had an intended interview guide that was mostly supervisory questions. But all of our supervisors were also parents. And so those questions, even though we intended it from a managerial standpoint, really they were addressing the questions based on their personal experience as parents. So among those supervisors, we had 7 mothers, 9 fathers, and 1 grandparent who was raising a grandchild. And you can see how the different careers broke out. Our sample is overwhelmingly skewed towards law enforcement and fire EMS, and that was partly just because that's where our professional networks were. We had a second effort, which was to interview fathers, and you can see that we had law enforcement and fire representation there. So this is our framework, our conceptual framework. As we've gone through the interviews, you can see that there are factors such as job demands, scheduling, family challenges, supports, individual outcomes, risks, and reactions. We're going to go through each of these constructs individually. There are quotes to support them. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read the quotes out to you. I would encourage you to review them as I'm talking about the construct, because the quotes really do highlight some of the issues that they face. So for job demands, we know that there are things inherent to the jobs, like physical demands, emotional demands, how quickly the pace of work is coming in. And you'll see from the quotes that these demands, that they're felt, both by supervisory staff recognize that their subordinates are undergoing those demands, and also from the individual workers out in the field. Scheduling, if you have not worked in one of these fields, scheduling is a significant challenge. For the fire service and EMS, shifts are typically 24 hours on and 48 hours off. So you can imagine if you're arranging daycare or if you have a partner at home that you're trying to actually see, that those 24-hour shifts can be problematic. Law enforcement, I have tried valiantly to understand their shift schedule, and it seems to be different for every agency, with some sort of non-predictable rotation, like 3 on, 2 off, 4 on, 3 off. It's typically 10 or 12-hour shifts, which is also problematic. Those shifts do not typically overlap with traditional daycare hours. So if you're starting your shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, finding a place where you can do daycare drop off at 6 a.m. Is very problematic. Family challenges is all of these different ways other than scheduling that are impacted. So partly because of scheduling, but there's also some other fallouts. So we talked about childcare. It's a significant financial burden if you're paying for extensive childcare. If you're lucky enough to find a place that does after-hours daycare, like from 3 to 7 o'clock or 3 to 9 o'clock at night, fees are significantly higher than traditional daycare arrangements. Another really big issue for families is whether or not they're seeing their partner. So if you're coming off a 24-hour shift and you haven't slept and you're getting off at 8 o'clock in the morning and you're going home, and you happen to be married to another police officer who is leaving at 8 o'clock in the morning to go to work, many participants reported that they would sometimes go 4 or 5 days with actually not seeing their partner other than to like hand off a baby in the garage while the other one left for work. So that becomes a significant issue. There's also a concern about restriction of the career for the co-parent, and that was not something that we anticipated. But if you have one parent who is primarily holding down the household and child duties, and you have another parent who's gone for 24 hours, at least 24 hours, every 48 hours, that parent who is the primary, who's taking care of most of the child care duties, then is facing career restrictions in terms of which positions they accept or being able to accept promotions. This has to be exactly the right angle. So for supports, the biggest support that participants noted was extended family support. So even for like hurricane duty, family members were coming in from 4 or 5 hours drive away to stay with children so that they could go in to report for hurricane duty. And so that was a really big helpful thing. Another really determining factor was supervisor support. So whether or not there were policies available in writing or informal flexibility that was an option, it really depended on their supervisor. If they had someone in their chain of command who understood the stresses and how difficult it was to balance things, they had a lot more options available to them than if they had someone in their chain of command that was very rigid or typically did not have children or had sort of a traditional division of labor within their own family structure. And so even if those formal policies did not exist, the fact that they had a supervisor that was supportive made a big difference. Individual outcomes, some of these listed are positive and some of them are obviously not. Things like working out at the gym, faith and religion sort of helped to offset job stressors, but there was also a lot of negative outcomes, such as alcohol and drugs, infidelity, and isolation. Many police officers reported issues related to compartmentalization. So, they would have a terrible call at work, kind of shut all that down, come home, and pretend that there had not been something significant at work. And that led to issues with distancing from significant others because clearly something was wrong, but they weren't verbalizing any of that. There's also an issue related to risk, right? Both law enforcement and working in the fire service have an inherent degree of risk. But there's also, once they had children, their perception of that risk and sort of the weight of that risk changed. So several mothers who continued working on the street while they were pregnant reported things like chasing a suspect and being the first officer on scene. And their perception of the risk of that interaction, if they got in a scuffle versus what it had been before, were very different. And there's also a change in, if I get hurt in the field or if I die in the field, I suddenly have children who are left parentless. And so the weight of that risk that's inherent to the job is much different once they're a parent. So I think there's pieces of this project that are a little bit unique, and I think this construct about reactions is a little bit more of a window than is typically explored. One of those heavy ones was guilt. And so for firefighters or law enforcement officers who had accepted those pieces of the job that were negative for themselves, now that they had families or now that they had children, there was some degree of guilt because they were bringing that negativity or they were bringing the weight of those concerns home to their families. And that piece about guilt is not often expressed, but it's a very important piece in terms of understanding those difficulties in reaching work-family balance. There's also some resentment of the job and anxiety. Again, those risks have a much bigger impact than they did previously. So we had some challenges. We had some challenges with the study. These are insulated professional groups. We know that, and we knew it going into it, but they're difficult to recruit and difficult to get to open up. Especially with the law enforcement officers, during the interviews, prior to saying something that was very weighty or sort of novel, they would reach back for reassurance that in fact this wasn't being videotaped, that it wouldn't be linked back to their name or their agency. And so there was some hesitancy to be forthcoming. We did use convenience sampling, and we did struggle a little bit with recruitment. We also had an unusual challenge of some folks that stepped forward to volunteer to participate, that, I can see Jen laughing, that were not even in the US. They were participating for the benefit of the incentive. And so we had to employ some unique ways to screen that out. Some of the strengths of the study is that we had a very strong multidisciplinary team from various representation within the university, and that included the USF Criminology Department. I personally am a firefighter paramedic, and so that did help in terms of breaking down some of those barriers. We changed the introduction for the interviews, probably about 5 to 10 interviews in, and that change was to emphasize that I was a retired firefighter. And with that change, it significantly increased the weight, the content of the interviews. And so I think that participatory piece, where if you're going to do research with these populations, you need to have representation from the field. And then we've been lucky enough to have a very strong core of students who have volunteered for project support along the way. So in terms of next steps, we've secured funding from the Women's Health Collaborative Seed Grant, and that funding will cover our interviews with mothers. We do have some interviews from mothers who self-identified in that supervisors group, but we have not done interviews with mothers who were entry-level police officers or firefighters. We are continuing to try to recruit obstetricians, trauma surgeons, emergency medicine physicians, but those are more difficult populations as well. We're going to continue to develop our framework and then, of course, disseminate our findings.
Okay, we'll keep moving along. Our next presenter is Anna Wilson. Ms. Wilson's from Auburn University, and she will be discussing her research assessing and controlling occupational risks related to COVID-19 in primary care practices. So, Anna?
Like you said, my name is Anna Wilson. I am currently working on my PhD at Auburn University, and my advisor and I have been working with UAB for the past around 3 years on multiple different research projects, and today I'm going to talk about assessing and controlling occupational risk related to COVID-19 in primary care practices. A lot of people have been focusing on emergency departments and first responders due to COVID, but the primary care practices has kind of fell to the bottom. So our main purpose of this study was to assess the overall perceived occupational risk at primary care clinics using lean methodologies and tools. To do this, we broke our research project into 4 main objectives. First, we wanted to see if the providers and clinical staff members actually understood the transmission of the virus. So how did the virus transmit through the clinic? We wanted to see that first. Next, we wanted to assess their perceived occupational risk. Third, we wanted to see how did the vaccination that was being put in place, how did it affect their perceived risk? And lastly, so UAB implemented multiple protocols during COVID and the transition. So we wanted to see how did these protocols make them feel. Did they feel more safe or less safe? Do they feel more exposed to the virus or less exposed? So the methodologies we used 2 main methodologies. So the first one was voice of the process. So voice of the process basically captures expectations, perception, and preferences, all from individuals. So we did this using interviews. The interviews were 23 open-ended or yes or no questions. However, for this study, we're only going to focus on 7. And all these interviews was gathered by our team. They were over teleconference, because we had restrictions where we could not go to the clinic. So the participants were from primary care clinics, especially the Inverness Clinic. It was a satellite clinic at UAB. So we had providers, which makes up your doctors, your nurse practitioners, and then we did clinical staff members, which is your CMAs, your LPNs, and your RNs. So we interviewed 3 providers, which made up about 50% of the overall providers, and we interviewed all the clinical staff members at the clinic. And our second method was organizational-wide surveys. So this captures point of view data from individuals. To do this survey, we actually partnered with Dr. Catherine Meese from the Department of Wellness and Research at UAB. This survey was gathered by a third party. It was all anonymous, so there was no identifying factors at all. The responses was organizational-wide. So this included all the departments at UAB. So that was inpatient and outpatient. However, we only looked at the outpatient responses. It was a Likert scale. It was 11 questions. However, we are only going to focus on 2 of those. 67 of the responses were from primary care providers, and 3 responses was from clinical staff members. For our first objective, assessing the understanding of virus transmission, we asked one main question. So we really wanted their opinion, so we emphasized that. What is the main way that COVID was transmitted in the clinic setting? And as you can see from the pie charts, providers and clinical staff members, the high majority of them both said airborne. However, the clinical staff members added touch to this as well because they had actually had to interact with the patients more. For our second objective, we wanted to see their perceived occupational risk. To do this, we asked 3 main questions. The first question we wanted to see was there one process or task that made them feel more exposed to the virus. The provider stated that treating sick patients, this is a common cold, COVID, or any kind of sickness, they felt they were more exposed to some kind of virus or to be able to get sick at all. But as you can see from the clinical staff members, 50% said there was no task or process that made them feel more exposed to the virus. And then 20% said taking a patient's oral temperature. So for this, the patient had to take off their mask. They had to get in a foot of the patient. They were being breathed on by the patient. So that made them feel more exposed. The second question was, do your patients have behaviors that make you feel more exposed to the virus? Then all the providers stated the patients not wearing a mask or not wearing them correctly made them more exposed to the virus. And the clinical staff members, the majority said the same thing. However, 30%, which was surprising to us, stated that patients didn't have a behavior that made them feel more exposed to the virus. And then lastly, for this objective, we asked, what percentage of your patients perform these behaviors daily? And as you see, it goes from 10% to 40% of the providers stated that their patients didn't wear a mask correctly or didn't wear a mask at all daily that they saw. Whereas the clinical staff members, the highest was 60% and the lowest was 1%. And that was for honesty about symptoms. A lot of the clinical staff members said that a lot of the patients wouldn't be honest about their symptoms. So they may had COVID, but they didn't tell them when they came into the clinic. They said they may had a common cold or something like that. For our third objective, we wanted to see how the vaccinations affect their perceived occupational risk. To do this, we asked 3 questions as well. So we asked, does knowing that your patient you're about to see has received the COVID vaccine affect your perceived exposure? For this, we had data from the Voice of the Process and our organizational survey. So all the providers at the clinic stated that if their patient they're about to see has received the vaccine, they felt less exposed. Similar to the organization-wide survey, they felt that if the patient they're about to see has received the vaccine, they felt less exposed. However, the clinical staff members, only 30% of them perceived a decrease in their exposure if the patient has received the vaccine at the clinic. They felt this was because that the patients could still get the virus even if they received the vaccine. However, on the organizational-wide survey, ranked an average of 7 out of 10 in reducing their exposure to the virus. The next question we asked, does any standard process change if the patient hasn't received a vaccine? And both the providers and clinical staff members had the same answer for this. Their process never changes if the patient has received the vaccine or not. However, it can change if the patient is experiencing symptoms at the time of the visit. And the third question is, what percentage of patients daily have you seen that has not seen received the vaccine? And a majority of the providers stated 40 to 45% of their patients daily hasn't received the vaccine. So they felt more exposed because over 40% hasn't received the vaccine. But only one stated about 25 hasn't received the vaccine. However, the clinical staff members was significantly lower. They said 50% of the clinical staff members interviewed stated 20 to 25% have not received the vaccine, where 30% stated 5% or less has not received the vaccine. For Objective 4, we wanted to see how the protocols were effective. Did they make the clinical staff members and providers feel less exposed to the virus? For this, we asked 4 questions. For the first question, we asked what protocols were implemented within the clinic to reduce your exposure to the virus. So to do this, we compiled word clouds so you can see which responses were repeated. For the providers mentioned screening patients and masking as the main protocol implemented. Whereas you can see from the clinical staff members, there was a wide variety of different implemented protocols. So we have masking, face shields, social distancing, and screening patients. However, masking and distancing was one of the top 2. For the second question, we want to know overall how effective do you believe these protocols to be to prevent the virus transmission? We asked this on a scale of 1 to 10, and we have the data from both the Voice of the Process and the organizational-wide survey. So for this organizational-wide survey, one provider stated a 6.5 out of 10 that these protocols were to prevent their of getting the virus. And on the organization-wide survey, as you can see, it was kind of all over the board. However, it was leaning more towards that these implemented protocols actually helped in preventing their exposure to the virus. For the clinical staff members, however, for the organization-wide surveys, they felt these implemented protocols did not help their exposure to the virus, with only a 2.5 out of 10 in the effectiveness. One more. And then we asked what percentage of staff and patients follow these protocols daily. So the masking, the social distancing, and all of those. So as you can see, for both the clinical staff and the patients, the lowest was 70%. So everybody pretty much followed the protocols put in place at the clinic. So that was a good thing in reducing their exposure to the virus for both the other patients and for the clinical staff members and the providers. Then lastly, we asked which implemented protocol mentioned made you feel less exposed to the virus. And as you can see from both the providers and clinical staff members, that masking's made a big difference in making them feel less exposed to the virus. And screening patients was another one. So before a patient came to the clinic during COVID, they were being called and they were being screened to make sure they didn't have symptoms so that they could come to the clinic. And if they were experiencing symptoms, they were put to telehealth or a virtual appointment type. So the conclusions that we came up with was that both the clinical staff members and providers had clear understanding of the virus transmission. This was a big topic at the time because it was right through the transition, and there was multiple opinions on how the virus was actually transmitted. The second one was objective 2. We stated that we identified and stated tasks and behaviors that contributed to the increase of risk exposure for both the providers and clinical staff members. And the third objective, all providers perceived their exposure decreased when seeing patients with a vaccine. However, clinical staff members varied on this one, and only 30% felt a decline. And then for our voice of the process interviews, they felt that UAB did a good job in implementing and creation of the protocols. However, for the organization-wide surveys, only the providers thought that the protocols implemented helped, whereas the clinical staff members felt like it wasn't effective enough. So for our study, the limitation was our responses was gathered over telehealth. So we believe that it's easier when you're in person, so you can pick up the patients, the providers and clinical staff members' mannerisms. So if they're tired or if they're burnt out, or just pick up a little cues of what they're saying. It was a relatively small sample size because our clinic only had 16 members and we interviewed 13. For our future work, we want to create a standard protocols for future generations and future pandemics. And I think this study could be implemented in other UAB settings, maybe in care inpatient settings. I would like to thank the NIOSH for their grant because made this possible. Without them, we couldn't figure out, did the clinical staff members or providers, did they feel more exposed, how they felt during this unprecedented time. Thank you.
It's dangerous. I have two microphones in my hand now. All right. Oop. I got distracted, see? All right, our final presenter in this session is AnnMarie Walton. And Dr. Walton is with Duke University, and her presentation is surface contamination and PPE use in inpatient oncology, the impact of COVID-19. So, Dr. Walton, are you there?
Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay. We can
Can
hear
you
you.
see
Go
me
ahead.
and hear?
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. All right, I'll just go ahead and get started, and I think I'll have to ask to advance the slides. So I first want to begin with, as all of the other presenters have done, words of gratitude to NIOSH and to NCO in particular for funding this pilot project. I also want to mention that I'm presenting on behalf of a pretty awesome team. Melissa Powell is the PhD student on our team, and she's here listening with me in the room today. Jessica Jin is a DNP student on our team, and she's working clinically as a nurse right now. Daniel Hatch, our biostatistician, and Yvonne Spasojevic, who did all of the analytical chemistry in this study. Will you please advance? So the objectives of our study, and really just our time together today, are to tell you a little bit about our first study, which NCO didn't fund. This is the second study, but we use the exact same measures and methodology. So I'll tell you about the first one first. And that's where we were interested in inpatient oncology surfaces that were most contaminated with anti-neoplastic drugs. And that took place before the pandemic. Then in that same study, we looked at PPE use and factors that predict PPE use among inpatient oncology healthcare workers. And with the funding that we received from NCO, we came back during the pandemic and looked at whether or not surface contamination changed and whether PPE use and factors that predict that use also changed. And our hypothesis was that people would be using more PPE during the pandemic, and then we would naturally see an increase in PPE use and a decrease in surface contamination. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not oncology nurses, I'll tell you a little bit about anti-neoplastic drugs. They are a class of hazardous drugs that are given to patients with cancer diagnosis and now given for a variety of other reasons as well, including very commonly rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. Exposure to these drugs can lead to carcinogenicity and adverse reproductive outcomes for healthcare workers, and that's well documented in the literature. Exposures to these drugs happen when a spill occurs on the unit, but also can happen just from routine dermal contact with contaminated surfaces. And we know that dermal exposure is the most common route of exposure. Next slide, please. PPE helps to protect healthcare workers. So think about chemotherapy-rated gloves, chemotherapy-rated gowns, and what we know in the literature supports is that PPE use is suboptimal among healthcare workers. There are a variety of reasons for this. Some of the things that have come up in the literature are workload and having just too many patients to be able to don and doff the proper PPE each time. Perceived barriers like lack of time, and then workplace safety climate has also been shown to predict PPE use. Surface contamination on units has been found in places where we would anticipate it, like IV poles and IV pumps, but it's also been found in places where we would not anticipate it, such as shared areas like where healthcare workers take breaks and eat their lunch, and healthcare worker restrooms as well. And we'll talk more about these surfaces in a minute. Next slide. So in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and we were requiring healthcare workers to use more and more PPE despite the PPE shortage challenges. And ONS, the Oncology Nursing Society, came out with a series of interim guidelines for oncology healthcare workers to help them make decisions when the optimal PPE was not available. That being said, even though there were supply challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic raised awareness about PPE use, and we thought kind of a natural experiment may have caused people to shift their behavior and use more PPE than pre-pandemic. And then this was really just a perfect natural experiment, a time to look at whether or not there was a change in PPE use and how that connected to surface contamination. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there was a study done in 2018 and we published that in 2020. It has all the same methods. We collected our data late in 2018. And our goal was to describe the inpatient oncology surfaces that were the most contaminated with these drugs, and then to characterize staff PPE use and factors that predict that use. Next slide. The methods used at both time points, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, were the same, and the units were the same, and the surfaces were the same. So this was a large academic medical center with 2 inpatient oncology units. We looked at surfaces in the patient rooms and then in these shared areas as well. And you would not expect PPE to be worn in shared areas. Again, these are staff break rooms and staff bathrooms. We used pre-measured templates for the sampling areas to make sure that we had standardized space that we were sampling. And the nursing staff who participated completed an online survey using a revised standardized instrument called the Revised Hazardous Drug Handling Questionnaire. And this included questions about barriers to PPE use, perceived risks of chemotherapy exposure, workplace safety climate, conflict of interest, and more. Next slide. So let me just share a few top kind of line results from our prior study, and then we'll talk about the changes. So what we found when we looked at surfaces, we looked at 2 anti-neoplastic drugs, cyclophosphamide and etoposide, and we found that 61% of the surfaces that we tested were what we would consider detectable and quantifiable for cyclophosphamide, and 30% were detectable and quantifiable for etoposide. But what does detectable and quantifiable really mean? So for our lab, where our level of detection was that 0.05 actually, our level of detection was very, very low. We could go down to picograms, but what we used was what commercial testing companies use, which is 0.05 nanograms per centimeter squared. And so when we took all of the levels that we could quantify and divided them, you'll see that had we been a commercial testing company instead of a scientific lab, we would have said that only 26% of surfaces were detectable and quantifiable for cyclophosphamide and 19% for etoposide. We had a very sensitive test. Next slide, please. In the first study, we found that the most contaminated areas were floors when it comes to the common areas. So you can see this floor near the common desk, floor in the locker room, floor in front of the pharmaceutical waste bin. So floors were highly contaminated in shared areas. And then in the patient room, you'll see toilet seat, remote control, some floors, IV poles, and doorknobs. And what was really striking to us there were the levels at which we found contamination with these drugs on the toilet seats. It was the most contaminated area between patient rooms and shared areas both. Next slide. So here are some other findings from our first study. Workplace safety climate was the only factor that was moderately predictive of PPE use, and PPE use was significantly positively related to self-efficacy as well in one of these two clinical units, but not in the other. You'll also see here that the most PPE was worn during administration, which is that orange bar. Less PPE was used during waste disposal, and then least in the handling of patient excreta. Next slide, please. Some other findings for us, again, I mentioned before, we were really struck by the high level of contamination on patient toilet seats, and it made us think about patient and family education. Patients go home after receiving these drugs and continue to void with large amounts of the drug in their urine and feces for 72 hours after receipt, and sometimes longer, depending on the drug and the patient's metabolism. It also made us really concerned about other healthcare workers like environmental services workers and nursing assistants who are predominantly assisting with toileting and or cleaning the toilets. Of interest, and I won't have anyone go back a slide, but closed system transfer devices were on there during administration, asking folks if they use this, which is what NIOSH would consider an engineering control. And about a third of the respondents said, yes, we use closed system transfer devices, when the reality was that the unit did not have these devices at all. And so there was some lack of understanding of what a closed system transfer device even was. Also, we looked for 2 anti-neoplastic drugs, and we knew which drug had been received in the room. So in about a third of these surfaces that we tested, we found the other drug that the patient had not received, which told us that either it was being left there from a prior patient and that the discharge cleaning was not sufficient, or that it had been tracked in by a healthcare worker, both of which are pretty significant findings. Next slide, please. So now I'll get into what the differences were during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I won't repeat any of our methods or measures because, again, as I said, they're exactly the same. So we were really just looking for changes in surface contamination, changes in PPE use, and whether or not that one factor that emerged as significant, workplace safety climate, was stable over time. Next slide, please. So we did some propensity scoring and found that this was a pretty stable group of healthcare workers. There wasn't much turnover among the nurses and nursing assistants. We used descriptive statistics to tell how much of the anti-neoplastic drug contamination was on each of these surfaces. And then we used paired t-tests to look at the differences between the 2 time points. Next slide. We found few statistically significant differences in surface contamination, and the top 3 surfaces at both time points were pretty much the same. We found slightly more contamination at time 2 when it came to doorknobs, but otherwise it was doorknobs and floors and a couple of other surfaces in the shared areas. And then in the patient rooms, again, toilet seats emerged as the most commonly contaminated, followed by remote controls and doorknobs once again. Next slide. PPE use, as we predicted, was significantly higher despite the challenges of the provision of supply during the pandemic. Especially, there were significant differences during administration of the drugs, handling of the excreta, and disposal of the drugs. And that's consistent with other studies that took place during the COVID-19 pandemic too. Next slide, please. Again, we had pretty similar healthcare workers between both time points, but this time, even though workplace safety climate hadn't changed, which we thought maybe it would have, it was stable, perceived risk of adverse health outcomes from exposure did increase. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So just a little bit of discussion on what we found. We really believe that PPE use, as you all know from the NIOSH hierarchy of controls, while important, is really the least effective. So here's a great example of people increasing their PPE use in 3 of these routine work tasks. And yet we really need these administrative controls and engineering controls, which would include things like training and changing staff ratios, as well as engineering controls like the closed system transfer device at the point of administration. We did find that we had minimal staff turnover, which was great, and a pretty stable workplace safety climate. So once again, I am very grateful to, last slide please, to the team that I worked with here at the Duke University School of Nursing and to NC OSHRC for funding us. And you'll find in the very last slide our references. And I think I can open for our panel to questions. Thank you.
All right, yep. Now we're going to open it up for all of our presenters to take questions. So if anybody has a question, please come up to the mic. Feel free to ask. Okay, coming.
Thank you for the presentations. They were all super interesting. My question is for Aashna. What have you thought about how you might communicate and translate your work for employers? Because it seems like there's a lot of application at the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're actually putting together a technical report right now that is laying out a ton of the findings from the study and making it very digestible for a public-facing audience. This will become available both to participants and, we're going to try to bring it to the media as well and to organizations. So the hope is that that will be able to catch their attention, and we're going to have a lot of findings translated into recommendations for both, impending and new mothers as well as the companies themselves.
Questions? Okay, we have somebody coming up.
So I apologize because I'm forgetting your name at this exact moment. The fraudulent respondents, I need to know how that went. They just jumped in and tried to pretend they were here? Like, how did this go? And how did you know they were fake?
It was a learning experience. We had posted a lot of on LinkedIn or other social media groups. And so the first one we did not identify as fraudulent until after the fact. The second one was, there was a lot of background noise. It almost sounded like they were in a street market. I think at one point we heard a goat. One of the questions was something like, perception of pregnant women in the fire service. This particular volunteer claimed to be a firefighter. And when he answered, he did have a heavy accent, but when he answered that they would all take up a collection and donate their own personal funds so that the pregnant woman did not have to come to work, that was sort of a red flag that it was not a legitimate answer. After the fact, we actually had where they were signing up on Qualtrics to participate, and Qualtrics does have a GPS option. Now, none of them pinged out of the country, but our target population was within the state of Florida. So we had quite a few that pinged in New York City and Kansas. And so from that point forward, we started reviewing where their Qualtrics survey was coming from before we scheduled them for an interview. He did contact me 6 times asking for his Amazon gift card.
We had the same issue.
So make a note, goats are a threat to both internal and external validity, so FYI. Other questions for our panel? I have one last question. I do. And I was curious, you mentioned during your presentation regarding the effectiveness of organizational policies, that providers were, I guess, much more confident in their effectiveness versus the clinical staff. Why do you think there's that disconnect?
The clinical staff members just felt like that the patients could still just get the virus, and I think it's because they interacted with the patients more. This study's ongoing, and we actually did time studies that showed that clinical staff members spend 50% more time with the patient than the actual providers do. And they're also in the closer contact. And even though the mask was in place, the clinical staff members had to take the mask off the majority of the time. So that's why they felt like these protocols wasn't helpful for them, because the providers, the patients kept on the mask, they kept social distancing, not unless they had to do a physical exam.
Okay, thanks. Oh, we have another question. Come on up. Yeah, come on up to the mic. That way we can get you for the virtual crowd.
Yes, my question is for Dr. Walton. It's 2 questions. So for the PPE, I know you mentioned housekeeping, environmental services, and handling of excrement, but do you propose that the toilet seats were exposed from coming off of their skin, or just the mishandling of patients' excrement?
That's a great question. So we know that chemotherapy comes out of patients largely unchanged. Anywhere between 20 and 60% of the parent drug ends up in the urine and the feces and the vomit of patients or anyone who's received these drugs. And so it's not even necessarily mishandling of excreta. Keep in mind that in these inpatient oncology units, especially one of these was a bone marrow transplant unit, the habit is for patients to store all of their urine, and then a healthcare worker measures that. They're on strict intake and output and dumps it and then flushes. And for those of you who are familiar with hospitals, we don't have lids on our toilets. So there's plume, aerosolization of this chemotherapy onto the toilet seats. And so it's not, the levels were really surprising to us, but it just points to another route of potential exposure or healthcare workers that have been under-considered in this research in the past, including nursing assistants who are predominantly responsible for toileting, and then EVS workers who are coming in and cleaning these surfaces. So it's not so much the patient's skin, though we also know that patients can sweat out some of this drug, and it's why we have some pretty strict practices around handling of linens that may be soiled or contaminated with sweat for patients receiving chemotherapy. But we think it's just the routine urination, defecation that's causing this other exposure on toilet seats.
And then my last question is, and I'm sure this is a question that is never ending, what did you find could be any reason why people are not using the PPE?
That's a great question. So there's a few different things at play here. One is that these gloves that we ask healthcare workers to wear are what are called chemotherapy rated. So they've been tested for use against 28 of these drugs. Some units supply a standard nitrile glove and a chemotherapy rated glove. For units that do that, people have to go out of their way to get the chemo rated gloves. So that's one thing to consider. That was not the case on this unit, but I've seen that other places. Second is that to be truly in compliance, you have to be wearing 2 pair of chemotherapy rated gloves. And we frequently saw folks use, in a prior observational study, use 1 pair only, not 2. Gowns are seldom used in the handling of excreta, which is unfortunate because, again, there's that potential for spray and aerosolization, but folks feel like it's a waste of PPE, and I can appreciate that as well, but that is the recommendation for practice by NIOSH and by USP, which is a pharmacopoeial standard. So those, it's provision of supply, it's taking time to don and doff, it's perceiving a risk of exposure, and that something bad would actually happen to you if you got chemotherapy on you. Some people just don't perceive much of a risk. And something I've heard a lot in my own practice is I'm no longer concerned about exposure. So I'm past my childbearing years is something that I hear often among nurses. Or nothing's happened to me yet, and I've been doing this for 20 or 30 years. And what we need to do is shift responsibility for workplace safety to everyone, even if it doesn't, even if you don't perceive the same risk for yourself. I hope that answers your question. I could talk about this all day.
Thank you, Dr. Walton. I think it reaffirms, too, that what we tell our kids is another reason, don't bring your phone into the toilet. Just saying. Okay, any other questions? Final questions for our panel? All right, let's give them another round of applause. Okay, we're getting ready to break for lunch, and lunch again is provided at the back, and we will be coming back at 1:20, so have a great lunch.